long before the traveler first set foot in Mondstadt, long before the 7 archons ruled their nations, there existed a kingdom that did not belong to the world above. A nation without a god. A civilization that grew in the shadow of the earth rather than beneath the sky. A kingdom whose ambition would one day provoke the heavens themselves. This was Khaenri'ah. For most people living in Teyvat, the name is little more than a forgotten rumor. The bards of Mondstadt do not sing of it. The scholars of Sumeru rarely speak its history aloud. Even the oldest records in Liyue treat the nation as a distant and tragic memory. Yet 500 years ago, Khaenri'ah was one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever seen. Its people built machines that rivaled the power of the gods. Its scholars experimented with forces that even the archons feared. And its rulers dared to imagine a future where humanity no longer depended on divine rule. That dream would eventually bring ruin. But to understand how the Cataclysm began, we first need to understand what Khaenri'ah actually was. Because Khaenri'ah was not simply another nation among the 7. It was something entirely different. Unlike the 7 nations governed by archons, Khaenri'ah existed outside the divine order of the world. The countries most travelers know today all follow a familiar structure. Each nation is guided by an archon who embodies one of the elements. Mondstadt follows the Anemo Archon Venti. Liyue was once ruled by the Geo Archon Zhongli. Inazuma answers to the Electro Archon Raiden Ei. Every civilization on the surface of Teyvat exists within this divine system. Every civilization except one. Khaenri'ah was founded as a godless nation. It did not worship an archon. It did not rely on divine protection. And most importantly, it did not recognize the authority of Celestia, the heavenly realm that governs the world. This single fact made Khaenri'ah fundamentally different from every other nation in history. Where the rest of Teyvat relied on gods to shape their civilizations, Khaenri'ah relied on something else entirely. Human ingenuity. Without divine guidance, the people of Khaenri'ah were forced to solve their problems through innovation. Over generations, this necessity gave rise to a culture that valued knowledge, invention, and experimentation above all else. Rather than receiving power from the gods, Khaenri'ah developed its own technologies. Mechanical constructs powered by mysterious energy. Advanced weapons capable of rivaling elemental abilities. And most famously, a strange branch of alchemy known as chemia. Unlike traditional alchemy practiced in other parts of Teyvat, chemia focused on the creation and manipulation of life itself. This field of study would eventually produce some of the most terrifying and mysterious creations in the world's history. But at the time, it was seen as a symbol of Khaenri'ah's brilliance. The kingdom had become a place where human potential seemed limitless. A place where the absence of gods was not a weakness, but a challenge. And the people of Khaenri'ah were determined to prove they could overcome it. Another defining feature of the nation was its location. Unlike the surface kingdoms scattered across Teyvat's continents, Khaenri'ah existed deep underground. The exact geography of the kingdom remains largely unknown, but multiple pieces of lore confirm that it was built beneath the surface of the world. This isolation served several purposes. First, it allowed the nation to grow without interference from other powers. Second, it protected Khaenri'ah from the direct influence of Celestia. And third, it created a society that developed its own identity separate from the rest of the world. To the people of Khaenri'ah, the surface nations likely seemed primitive. Their reliance on gods could have been interpreted as a sign of weakness. Why depend on divine intervention when humanity could shape its own destiny? Over centuries, this philosophy became deeply embedded in the culture of the nation. Khaenri'ah did not see itself as inferior to the divine order. It saw itself as proof that humanity did not need the gods at all. Among the many intellectual pursuits of Khaenri'ah, none became more influential than chemia. This discipline was far more than simple alchemy. Chemia sought to uncover the fundamental principles of creation itself. If traditional alchemists tried to transform metals or manipulate elemental reactions, practitioners of chemia aimed for something much more ambitious. They wanted to create life, not imitate it, not alter existing organisms, but generate entirely new beings from raw materials. The philosophical implications of this pursuit were enormous. If humans could create life, then they would be replicating an ability traditionally reserved for gods. In a world where divine authority shaped civilization, that idea alone was revolutionary. And in Khaenri'ah, it was encouraged. Scholars, researchers, and alchemists pushed further and further into unknown territory, developing theories and experiments that would have been considered unthinkable elsewhere. For a time, their work produced remarkable results. But it also laid the foundation for events that would eventually shake the entire world. While the intellectual achievements of Khaenri'ah often received the most attention, the nation also possessed a strong political structure. At the center of this structure stood the ruling family known as the Eclipse Dynasty. This royal line governed Khaenri'ah during the height of its power and oversaw many of the developments that defined the kingdom's golden age. Historical records about the dynasty remain limited, but several important figures are known to have existed within its ranks. The Eclipse Dynasty maintained the authority needed to coordinate the nation's military, research institutions, and technological expansion. Under their rule, Khaenri'ah transformed into a highly organized civilization capable of competing with the divine nations above. But the dynasty also presided over a kingdom that was becoming increasingly ambitious. As technology advanced and alchemy continued to evolve, the boundaries between human achievement and divine power began to blur. And when those boundaries start to disappear, conflict often follows. From the perspective of Celestia, Khaenri'ah represented something unprecedented. A civilization that had risen to power without divine approval. A nation that openly pursued knowledge capable of rivaling the gods. And a culture that believed humanity could control its own fate. For centuries, this situation may have remained tolerable. But history has shown that the world of Teyvat operates according to certain rules. Civilizations that grow too powerful, that uncover forbidden knowledge, or that attempt to challenge the authority of the heavens, often meet the same fate. They are erased. 500 years ago, Khaenri'ah would become the next civilization to face that judgment. But before its fall, the nation experienced a period of extraordinary prosperity. A time when its cities flourished. Its scholars made astonishing discoveries. And its people believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new age for humanity. An age where gods would no longer dictate the future of the world. Historians would later remember this period as the Golden Age of Khaenri'ah. And it is during this era that the kingdom reached the height of its power. If the early history of Khaenri'ah was defined by survival and innovation, its Golden Age was defined by confidence. By the time the Eclipse Dynasty had firmly established its rule, the underground kingdom had transformed into something remarkable. What began as a secluded nation beneath the surface had grown into one of the most advanced civilizations the world of Teyvat had ever seen. And unlike the nations of the surface, Khaenri'ah had achieved all of it without the protection or guidance of a god. This single fact shaped everything about the civilization. In places like Mondstadt or Liyue, divine authority influenced nearly every aspect of life. The presence of an archon was not merely political. It was cultural, spiritual, and even technological. The gods of the Seven shaped the way their nations developed. Khaenri'ah had no such influence. Its cities, its knowledge, and its systems of power were built entirely by human hands. And because of this, the kingdom evolved in ways that the surface world had never seen before. The architecture of Khaenri'ah alone revealed just how different the nation had become. While the cities of the surface tended to blend natural landscapes with traditional structures, Khaenri'ah's settlements were built with an almost mechanical precision. Massive stone structures rose beneath the underground sky, illuminated by artificial sources of light rather than sunlight. Bridges and towers connected vast sections of the capital, forming a cityscape that seemed engineered rather than grown. But the most striking elements of Khaenri'ah's architecture were not its buildings. They were its machines. Centuries before the modern era of Teyvat, Khaenri'ah had already mastered forms of mechanical engineering that rivaled the elemental abilities of the gods. These machines were not simple tools or defensive weapons. They were autonomous constructs capable of independent movement and combat. Many of them still exist today. Across the ruins scattered throughout the world, travelers occasionally encounter enormous mechanical guardians that awaken when disturbed. These constructs, commonly referred to as ruin guards and ruin hunters, are remnants of Khaenri'ah's technological legacy. Although modern scholars struggle to fully understand how these machines operate, their design reveals the incredible level of engineering that the kingdom had achieved. They were not powered by visions. They were not animated by divine energy. They were the product of pure technological advancement. And they were only one example of the kingdom's achievements. Within Khaenri'ah, scientific and alchemical research were treated with enormous importance. Entire institutions were dedicated to expanding the boundaries of knowledge, and scholars from across the kingdom devoted their lives to understanding the nature of the world. Among these fields of study, the discipline known as alchemy continued to develop rapidly. Alchemy had already begun to explore the manipulation of life itself, but during the golden age of Khaenri'ah, these experiments became far more ambitious. Researchers pushed beyond the limits of traditional alchemy and began investigating the very foundations of biological creation. What made this pursuit so extraordinary was the philosophical belief behind it. In most cultures, life was considered sacred, something granted by the gods or shaped by natural forces beyond human control. But in Khaenri'ah, scholars began to ask a different question. What if life could be created artificially? What if humanity could replicate the process of creation itself? For the alchemists of the kingdom, this was not merely a theoretical discussion. It became an active field of experimentation, one that attracted some of the most brilliant minds in the nation. These researchers would eventually become central figures in the story of Khaenri'ah's fall. But during the Golden Age, their work was viewed as proof of humanity's limitless potential. The kingdom's military strength also reflected this philosophy of independence. Without divine protection, Khaenri'ah had been forced to develop powerful defensive forces to ensure its survival. Over time, these forces evolved into a highly disciplined military organization composed of elite warriors and strategists. Among these soldiers were the legendary knights who served the royal court. These knights were not merely bodyguards or ceremonial figures. They represented the peak of Khaenri'ah's martial tradition, trained to defend the nation against any threat that might arise. One of the most notable figures associated with this order was Dainsleif, who would later become known as the Twilight Sword. Long before the Cataclysm, Dainsleif served as a royal guard tasked with protecting the leadership of the kingdom. His position placed him at the center of Khaenri'ah's political and military structure, allowing him to witness the events that would eventually lead to the nation's destruction. But during the Golden Age, the kingdom had little reason to fear collapse. Its cities were thriving. Its military was strong. Its scholars were making discoveries that rivaled the achievements of the gods themselves. For ordinary citizens living in Khaenri'ah, daily life reflected the prosperity of this era. While detailed records about civilian life remained scarce, scattered pieces of lore suggest that the population enjoyed a high standard of living supported by the kingdom's technological advancements. Automated constructs likely assisted with labor and infrastructure, reducing the need for physically demanding work. Education and scholarship were widely respected, and intellectual achievement was celebrated as a cornerstone of society. This environment created a culture that valued curiosity and progress. Children growing up in Khaenri'ah would have been surrounded by machines, research laboratories, and scholars discussing theories about the nature of the world. In many ways, the kingdom may have resembled a vast research civilization where innovation was woven into everyday life. Trade and exploration also played an important role in the kingdom's development. Although Khaenri'ah was geographically isolated beneath the surface, it was not completely cut off from the rest of Teyvat. Over time, travelers and explorers from the kingdom ventured into the surface world, establishing contact with other regions and studying the cultures that existed above. These journeys likely allowed Khaenri'ah scholars to observe the civilizations ruled by the 7 archons. From their perspective, these nations must have appeared both fascinating and puzzling. Here were societies that relied heavily on divine authority, yet often seemed technologically less advanced than the underground kingdom. This contrast may have reinforced the belief that humanity did not require gods to achieve greatness. But while Khaenri'ah's golden age represented a triumph of human ingenuity, it also contained the seeds of future disaster. Because the same curiosity that drove the kingdom's progress also pushed its scholars toward increasingly dangerous territory. The pursuit of knowledge rarely stops at safe boundaries. And in the laboratories of Khaenri'ah, certain researchers began to explore ideas that would eventually cross those boundaries entirely. Among them was a figure whose work would become one of the most controversial chapters in the history of Teyvat. An alchemist whose name would later be whispered with equal parts awe and fear. Rhinedottir. Her research into the creation of life would change the fate of Khaenri'ah forever. And understanding her work is the key to understanding how the golden age of this civilization eventually transformed into catastrophe. During the golden age of Khaenri'ah, few fields of study captured the imagination of its scholars more than Khaenri'ah. In a civilization that already prided itself on innovation, Khaenri'ah represented the ultimate frontier. If machines and engineering proved that humans could rival the power of the elements, Khaenri'ah promised something far greater. It suggested that humanity might one day rival the gods themselves. Because Khaenri'ah was not merely a variation of alchemy. It was an attempt to understand the fundamental process of creation. While ordinary alchemy sought to transmute substances or refine materials, Khaenri'ah pursued something far more ambitious. It sought to create life from nothing. To the people of Teyvat, life was traditionally understood as something that either evolved naturally or was shaped by divine influence. Gods created worlds. Nature produced living beings. Humanity simply existed within that structure. But the scholars of Khaenri'ah began to question that assumption. If the laws of the universe could be understood deeply enough, perhaps creation itself could be replicated. Perhaps life was not a divine mystery at all. Perhaps it was simply a process. And if that process could be discovered, then it could also be controlled. Among the many alchemists exploring these ideas, one name would eventually stand above all others: Rhinedottir. But history rarely remembers her by that name. Most people know her by another title: Gold. Rhinedottir was not simply an alchemist working within the institutions of Khaenri'ah. She was one of the greatest practitioners of Khaenri'ah the nation had ever produced. Even among the brilliant scholars of the kingdom, her work stood apart. Where others studied the mechanics of life, Rhinedottir attempted to recreate it entirely. This ambition placed her at the very edge of scientific possibility. Every experiment pushed further into territory that no one had explored before. But unlike many researchers who hesitated when faced with the unknown, Rhinedottir seemed willing to pursue her work without restraint. In Khaenri'ah, such ambition may initially have been celebrated. The culture of the nation rewarded discovery and intellectual courage. Scholars who expanded the limits of knowledge were often treated with admiration. And for a time, Rhinedottir's experiments appeared to justify that admiration. Her research began producing results. Life that did not arise from natural birth. Beings that were constructed through alchemical processes rather than biological ones. Synthetic life. To understand the significance of Rhinedottir's achievements, it helps to consider the philosophical implications behind them. In most traditions, the ability to create life belongs only to divine entities. Gods shape the world, grant life to mortals, and influence the balance of nature. By discovering a way to replicate that process artificially, Rhinedottir was effectively stepping into a role that had previously belonged only to the divine. She was not merely studying creation. She was imitating it. And this is where the discipline of Khaenri'ah began to transform into something more controversial. If humans could create life, what defined the boundary between humanity and godhood? This question would soon become impossible to ignore. One of the most famous creations associated with Rhinedottir's research is a figure who still walks the world of Teyvat today: Albedo. Unlike many of the monstrous creations later linked to Gold's experiments, Albedo represents one of the most refined examples of synthetic life ever produced. According to his own accounts, Albedo was created through Khaenri'ah as an artificial human. He was not born through natural means. His body was formed through alchemical processes designed to replicate human physiology with remarkable precision. More than that, he was created with intelligence, self-awareness, and the capacity for independent thought. In many ways, Albedo appears indistinguishable from a normal human being. Yet beneath that human appearance lies something fundamentally different. He is a living demonstration that the process of creating artificial life succeeded. But Albedo's existence also reveals something else about Rhinedottir's research. Even if her experiments produced remarkable results, they were not necessarily stable. Albedo himself has hinted multiple times that his existence carries certain risks. His creator entrusted him with knowledge that he does not fully understand, and he is aware that his own nature could potentially become dangerous. This uncertainty reflects the deeper instability of Khaenri'ah itself. Because while some experiments succeeded, others produced far more destructive results. Among the most infamous creations attributed to Rhinedottir is a being that once terrorized the skies of Mondstadt. a creature known as Durin. Durin was a massive dragon-like entity created through Khaenri'ah. Unlike Albedo, whose design attempted to replicate a human form, Durin represented something entirely different. It was a synthetic monster, a being of immense power whose existence defied the natural order of the world. Durin eventually emerged from Khaenri'ah during the Cataclysm, flying across the skies of Mondstadt and spreading destruction in its wake. The creature's immense strength forced the Anemo Archon Venti and the Dragon Dvalin to confront it in battle. The clash ended with Durin's defeat, and the creature's enormous body eventually came to rest upon the frozen peaks of Dragonspine. Even centuries later, remnants of Durin's corrupted blood continue to influence the region. The story of Durin illustrates something important about Rhinedottir's research. Khaenri'ah was capable of creating life, but it was not always capable of controlling what it created. Beyond individual creations like Albedo and Durin, Rhinedottir's work also explored a much more ambitious concept: the idea of the primordial human. Within the philosophy of Khaenri'ah, some alchemists believe that humanity itself might be the result of an original alchemical process. If that theory were true, then the earliest humans could have been created through methods similar to those now being rediscovered by Khaenri'ah's scholars. This possibility led researchers to pursue an extraordinary goal: to recreate the original form of humanity. Not simply an imitation, but a perfected version of the first human being. The primordial human would represent the ideal state of existence, free from the limitations and imperfections that affect ordinary people. Whether Rhinedottir ever succeeded in achieving this goal remains uncertain, but the pursuit of such an idea reveals just how far the ambitions of Khaenri'ah's alchemists had expanded. They were no longer satisfied with creating individual organisms. They were attempting to redefine the nature of humanity itself. By the final years of Khaenri'ah's Golden Age, the research surrounding Khaenri'ah had reached a level of complexity and danger that few fully understood. The kingdom had achieved extraordinary breakthroughs: synthetic life, powerful alchemical constructs, theoretical models that challenged the foundations of biology and creation. But each of these discoveries also pushed the civilization closer to a boundary that may never have been meant to be crossed. Because knowledge has consequences. And in the world of Teyvat, certain forms of knowledge attract attention from powers far beyond human control. Among the scholars of the kingdom, whispers began to circulate about a dangerous category of information. Knowledge that did not simply expand understanding. Knowledge that threatened the stability of the world itself. Knowledge that would later become known by a single name: forbidden knowledge. And the deeper Khaenri'ah's researchers dug into the mysteries of creation, the closer they came to uncovering it. By the final years of its golden age, the civilization of Khaenri'ah had reached a level of technological and intellectual advancement that few other societies in Teyvat could rival. Its machines could move without divine power. Its alchemists could create living beings through Khaenri'ah. Its scholars openly pursued knowledge that other nations might have considered impossible. For the people of Khaenri'ah, this progress was proof that humanity did not need the gods to flourish. But beneath this optimism, a far more dangerous discovery was beginning to surface. Because not all knowledge in Teyvat is safe to possess. Some knowledge carries consequences simply by existing. And the deeper the scholars of Khaenri'ah pushed their research, the closer they came to something that the world itself seemed determined to reject. A concept known only as forbidden knowledge. In ordinary terms, knowledge is simply information. It can be studied, recorded, and passed from one generation to the next. Civilizations grow stronger as their understanding of the world expands. But forbidden knowledge is different. In the lore of Teyvat, forbidden knowledge is not simply information that has been hidden or censored. It is knowledge that does not belong in the world. Knowledge that originates from beyond the natural order established within Teyvat's reality. Whenever it appears, it behaves less like a discovery and more like an infection. Those who encounter it do not simply learn new facts about the universe. Instead, their minds become overwhelmed by ideas that the world itself cannot contain. This often leads to madness, corruption, or physical transformation. Forbidden knowledge spreads like a disease, warping both the minds of individuals and the environment around them. Even powerful gods have struggled to contain its influence. And long before the Cataclysm of Khaenri'ah, there was already a historical example of what happens when a civilization attempts to harness it. The ancient kingdom ruled by King Dishret. Thousands of years before the fall of Khaenri'ah, the deserts of Sumeru were home to a powerful civilization led by King Dishret. Unlike many rulers of his era, Dishret did not simply accept the limitations of mortal knowledge. Much like the scholars of Khaenri'ah, he sought to uncover deeper truths about the universe. But in doing so, he encountered something dangerous. Dishret discovered traces of forbidden knowledge connected to the abyss. Rather than rejecting it, he chose to pursue it further. His reasoning is still debated among scholars, but many believe he hoped that understanding this knowledge would allow humanity to transcend the boundaries imposed by the gods. In other words, his ambitions may not have been so different from those of Khaenri'ah centuries later. But Dishret's experiments produced catastrophic consequences. Forbidden knowledge began to spread throughout his civilization, corrupting both the environment and the minds of his people. Reality itself seemed to destabilize under its influence. Eventually, the situation became so dangerous that Dishret himself sacrificed his life in an attempt to contain the disaster. Even with his sacrifice, the damage left lasting scars on the desert region. The tragedy of King Dishret's kingdom stands as one of the earliest examples of forbidden knowledge disrupting the balance of Teyvat. And yet, centuries later, another civilization would begin moving toward the same danger. To understand why forbidden knowledge is so dangerous, it helps to consider the role played by a mysterious structure known as Irminsul. Irminsul is often described as the great tree of knowledge that stores the memories and history of the entire world. Every event that occurs within Teyvat is somehow recorded within its structure. Every civilization, every discovery, every moment of history becomes part of the information stored within Irminsul. In many ways, Irminsul acts as the memory of the planet itself. But this system has limits. It can only store information that belongs within the natural structure of the world. Forbidden knowledge does not follow those rules. When such knowledge enters Teyvat, it behaves like corrupted data introduced into a delicate system. It does not integrate smoothly with the world's memory. Instead, it spreads instability. In extreme cases, the presence of forbidden knowledge can threaten the integrity of Irminsul itself. If the world's memory becomes corrupted, the consequences could extend far beyond a single nation. Reality itself could begin to unravel. Because of this, powerful forces within the world appear to monitor and react to the appearance of forbidden knowledge very aggressively. One of those forces resides high above the skies of Teyvat, the domain known as Celestia. Celestia occupies a unique position in the world. Although very little direct information about it exists, multiple historical events suggest that it functions as a form of oversight for the civilizations of Teyvat. When societies grow too powerful or begin to uncover knowledge that threatens the balance of the world, Celestia sometimes intervenes. These interventions are rarely subtle. Entire civilizations have vanished under mysterious circumstances after reaching certain levels of technological or intellectual advancement. The pattern has repeated throughout history. A powerful civilization rises. It begins to explore forbidden knowledge or challenge the authority of the heavens. And eventually, it disappears. Some scholars have come to believe that Celestia actively maintains a cycle of destruction designed to prevent humanity from advancing too far beyond certain limits. If this theory is correct, then Khaenri'ah may not have been the first civilization to challenge those limits. But it may have been the most successful. For centuries, Khaenri'ah thrived without divine oversight. Its technology rivaled the gods. Its alchemists created new forms of life. And its scholars explored mysteries that other nations were too afraid to investigate. From Celestia's perspective, such a civilization might have appeared dangerously close to breaking the rules of the world itself. Whether Khaenri'ah intentionally discovered forbidden knowledge or simply approached it through their research remains unclear. But several pieces of lore strongly suggest that the kingdom eventually crossed that line. Its experiments with alchemy, its attempts to recreate life, its pursuit of the primordial origins of humanity. Each of these fields of study could have brought its scholars closer to information that the world itself was not meant to contain. And once that knowledge entered the system, the consequences may have become impossible to stop. Forbidden knowledge does not simply remain inside laboratories. It spreads through research, through memory, through the network of Irminsul itself. If the scholars of Khaenri'ah truly uncovered such knowledge, then the threat it posed would not have been limited to their own nation. It could have endangered the entire world. And if Celestia believed that to be the case, its response would likely have been swift. Because throughout the history of Teyvat, one pattern appears again and again. When a civilization approaches knowledge that threatens the structure of the world, the heavens eventually intervene. By the time the final years of Khaenri'ah arrived, the kingdom stood at the peak of its power. Its scholars had pushed the boundaries of creation. Its machines rivaled the abilities of gods. Its ambitions had grown beyond anything humanity had previously attempted. But with each new discovery, the kingdom also stepped closer to a line that history had warned about many times before. A line between progress and catastrophe. And when that line was finally crossed, the result would not be a quiet correction. It would be one of the most devastating events in the history of Teyvat. An event remembered simply as the Cataclysm. For centuries, the rise of Khaenri'ah had been quiet. The kingdom existed beneath the surface of Teyvat, separated from the divine nations above. Its people built machines, studied alchemy, and pursued knowledge that most civilizations would never dare to touch. To the outside world, Khaenri'ah remained distant and mysterious. Then, 500 years ago, something changed. The first signs of the disaster did not appear as a political conflict or a declaration of war. Instead, they appeared as monsters. Creatures that had never been seen before began emerging across the world. They did not resemble ordinary animals or elemental beings. Their forms were unnatural, twisted by forces that seemed completely foreign to the natural order of Teyvat. Many of these creatures would later become associated with what people now call the Abyss. At the time, however, no one understood where they came from. But in hindsight, the origin of these monsters points directly toward the experiments that had been unfolding in Khaenri'ah. Among the earliest and most dramatic events of the Cataclysm occurred in Mondstadt. High above the mountains and forests of the region, a colossal shadow appeared in the sky. The creature was enormous, far larger than any dragon the people of Mondstadt had ever encountered. Its wings stretched across the clouds as it descended upon the land, bringing destruction wherever it flew. This was Durin. Durin was not a natural dragon. It was a creation of alchemy, brought into existence through the discipline of alchemy by Rhinedottir. Whatever purpose the creature had originally been intended to serve, by the time it appeared above Mondstadt, it had become a catastrophic threat. Durin's presence corrupted the land beneath it. Its blood carried a strange and poisonous energy capable of warping both living beings and the environment itself. Entire regions were contaminated simply by the creature passing overhead. For the people of Mondstadt, the attack must have seemed like the arrival of a nightmare. Cities prepared for evacuation. Knights mobilized their defenses. But even the strongest human armies could not hope to defeat a creature like Durin. The responsibility fell to the guardians of the region. The first to answer the threat was the Anemo Archon, Venti. Unlike many other gods in Teyvat, Venti rarely intervened directly in the affairs of mortals. Mondstadt was a nation built around the ideal of freedom, and its Archon preferred to allow its people to guide their own future. But the Cataclysm was not an ordinary crisis. Durin's arrival threatened to devastate the entire region, and the danger it represented extended far beyond the borders of Mondstadt. Venti was not alone in confronting the dragon. Fighting beside him was Dvalin, one of the four winds that protected Mondstadt. Dvalin was a powerful dragon in his own right, revered by the people of Mondstadt as a guardian spirit of the skies. When Durin descended upon the region, Dvalin rose to meet the creature in battle. The clash between the two dragons was enormous. Their fight tore across the skies above Mondstadt, sending shockwaves across the mountains and valleys below. At the height of the battle, Dvalin managed to pierce Durin's body, fatally wounding the monstrous creature. But victory came at a cost. As Durin fell, its corrupted blood spilled across the mountains. The dragon's massive body eventually crashed into the frozen peaks of Dragonspine, where it remains to this day. Even centuries later, traces of Durin's corruption continue to affect the region. For Mondstadt, the battle ended with survival. But across the rest of Teyvat, the Cataclysm was only beginning. As monsters spread throughout the world, the Archons of the Seven Nations were forced to respond. Reports of strange creatures, corrupted landscapes, and unnatural disasters began arriving from multiple regions at once. Whatever had triggered the Cataclysm, it was not limited to a single kingdom. Entire areas were descending into chaos. One of the most tragic consequences of this conflict occurred in Inazuma. At the time, Inazuma was ruled jointly by twin gods. One of them was Raiden Mikoto, the original Electro Archon. The other was her sister, Rhinedottir, who served as her closest ally and protector. When the Cataclysm began spreading across Teyvat, the forces of Inazuma were mobilized to confront the threat. Mikoto personally entered the conflict. What exactly happened during the battle remains unclear, but the outcome is known. Mikoto did not survive. The death of the Electro Archon marked one of the most significant losses during the Cataclysm. Her passing forced EI to assume the role of the new Archon of Inazuma, fundamentally altering the future of the nation. The trauma of losing her sister would later influence many of EI's decisions, including the policies that defined Inazuma's later history. But during the Cataclysm itself, the loss of Mikoto was only one of many tragedies unfolding across the world. While the Archon struggled to contain the spreading chaos, the true center of the disaster lay far beneath the surface, within Khaenri'ah itself. By this point, the kingdom's experiments and ambitions had reached a breaking point. Whether through forbidden knowledge, uncontrolled alchemy, or a combination of multiple factors, something inside the nation had triggered a chain reaction that could no longer be contained. Monsters poured out of the underground kingdom and into the world above. These creatures appeared in countless forms. Some resembled twisted beasts. Others seemed like distorted versions of humanoid figures. Many carried the strange energy associated with the abyss. As these entities spread across Teyvat, they destabilized entire regions. Human armies were overwhelmed. Cities struggled to defend themselves. Even powerful beings like dragons and gods were forced into direct confrontation. The Cataclysm had become a global disaster, and at the center of it all stood the kingdom that had once believed humanity could control its own destiny. The events unfolding during this period likely caught the attention of the highest authority in the world, the realm above the skies, Celestia. For centuries, Celestia had remained distant from the affairs of the surface nations. It rarely intervened directly in human civilization. But the Cataclysm represented something far more serious than an ordinary conflict. A powerful underground civilization had unleashed forces capable of destabilizing the entire world. Forbidden knowledge may have been involved. Synthetic life forms were spreading across the land, and the influence of the abyss was beginning to grow. From the perspective of Celestia, the situation may have appeared dangerously close to the collapse of the world's natural order. And when that order is threatened, the heavens sometimes respond. The intervention that followed would bring the history of Khaenri'ah to a violent end. By the time the Archons and the forces of the world began to regain control of the spreading disasters, the focus of the conflict had shifted. The monsters had origins. The corruption had a source. And that source was the underground kingdom that had once represented humanity's greatest triumph. Khaenri'ah, the nation that had risen without gods, the civilization that had challenged the limits of knowledge, now stood on the edge of annihilation, because the next stage of the Cataclysm would not simply involve monsters or battles. It would involve the direct judgment of the heavens. And when that judgment arrived, Khaenri'ah would not survive it. By the time the catastrophe reached its peak, the kingdom of Khaenri'ah had already lost control of the forces it had unleashed. The monsters appearing across Teyvat, the corruption spreading through the land, and the violent battles fought by the Archons were only the visible surface of the disaster. The true collapse was happening inside Khaenri'ah itself. What exactly occurred in the final moments of the kingdom remains one of the most mysterious events in the entire history of the world. The surviving records are fragmented, and many of the witnesses who experienced those events have either disappeared or remained silent. But the outcome is clear. 500 years ago, the nation was destroyed, not conquered by another kingdom, not slowly abandoned over time. Destroyed in a single catastrophic event that erased an entire civilization from the world. And according to the fragments of lore that remain, that destruction came from above, from the authority of Celestia. For most people living in Teyvat, Celestia is little more than a distant presence in the sky. Legends describe it as the realm of the gods, the place where certain individuals ascend after performing great deeds. It appears high above the world, visible only as a floating island suspended beyond reach. But Celestia represents more than a distant paradise. It appears to function as the ultimate authority governing the balance of the world. Throughout history, there have been multiple examples of civilizations rising to incredible heights of power before suddenly disappearing. These disappearances often occur when those societies begin to explore forbidden knowledge or challenge the structure imposed by the divine order. When such moments arise, Celestia sometimes intervenes. The Cataclysm of Khaenri'ah appears to be one of the clearest examples of this intervention. At the center of Celestia's authority is a mysterious concept known as the Heavenly Principles. The Heavenly Principles represent the fundamental laws that govern the structure of the world. These principles appear to dictate what is permitted within Teyvat and what is considered a violation of the natural order. When civilizations break those rules, consequences follow. The exact nature of the Heavenly Principles remains largely unknown, but one encounter early in the story of Genshin Impact offers a glimpse of their power. When the traveler and their sibling first attempted to leave Teyvat, they were confronted by a powerful being often referred to as the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles. This entity demonstrated the ability to manipulate space, seal individuals away, and enforce the laws of the world with overwhelming authority. If the Sustainer represents the enforcement of Celestia's will, then the destruction of Khaenri'ah may have been carried out under that same authority. When Celestia finally acted, the results were devastating. The underground kingdom that had once rivaled the gods was reduced to ruins. The details of the attack remain unclear, but it is evident that the destruction was not limited to military defeat. The very structure of the civilization was erased. Cities collapsed. Institutions vanished. The advanced machines that had once represented the pride of Khaenri'ah were scattered and buried beneath centuries of ruin. In the present day, remnants of this technology can still be found throughout the world in the form of ancient constructs known as ruin guards and ruin hunters. These machines are silent reminders of what the kingdom once achieved. But the true tragedy of Khaenri'ah did not end with the destruction of its cities. It continued with the fate of its people. When the heavens delivered their judgment upon the kingdom, they did not simply destroy the nation. They punished its population. The survivors of Khaenri'ah were subjected to a curse that would follow them for the next 5 centuries. This curse manifested in 2 different ways. The outcome depended largely on the bloodline of the individual affected. For those who possessed pure Khaenri'ah heritage, the punishment took the form of immortality. Their bodies would no longer age normally. They could not die. They would wander the world indefinitely, forced to witness the passage of centuries while carrying the memory of their destroyed homeland. At first glance, immortality might appear to be a gift. But over time, it becomes something far more painful. Memories accumulate endlessly. Losses never fade. Regret never disappears. Many of the survivors eventually suffered from erosion of the mind, losing pieces of themselves as the centuries passed. Among the known individuals affected by this curse is Dainsleif, once a royal guard of Khaenri'ah. 500 years after the fall of his nation, he continues to wander the world, searching for answers and witnessing the consequences of the Cataclysm. The fate of other survivors was far worse. Those who did not possess pure Khaenri'ah lineage were transformed. The curse twisted their bodies into grotesque forms that barely resembled the people they once were. Their intelligence faded. Their memories disappeared. Over time, they became creatures that modern travelers encounter across nearly every region of Teyvat. Creatures known as hilichurls. For centuries, most people believed hilichurls were simply primitive monsters native to the world. They were treated as little more than hostile creatures that needed to be driven away from human settlements. But the truth behind their origin reveals something far more tragic. Many hilichurls were once citizens of Khaenri'ah. They were victims of the same divine punishment that destroyed their homeland. The masks they wear may hide faces that no longer resemble their former selves. Their strange language and rituals may be fragments of a culture that has long since vanished. In this sense, every hilichurl camp scattered across Teyvat represents a lingering scar left by the Cataclysm. A reminder that the destruction of Khaenri'ah did not end when the kingdom fell. It continues to exist in the twisted forms of its former people. While most of the survivors either wandered the world or transformed into hilichurls, the Cataclysm also produced another consequence. A group of individuals who refused to accept the destruction of their nation. These survivors retained enough intelligence and determination to organize themselves once again. Over time, They formed a secretive faction dedicated to opposing the divine authority that had destroyed Khaenri'ah. This faction would eventually become known as the Abyss Order. The Abyss Order is composed of beings connected to the same forces that spread across the world during the Cataclysm. Unlike ordinary hilichurls, however, its members possess clear goals and a structured hierarchy. They believe that the destruction of Khaenri'ah was not simply a tragedy. It was an injustice, and they intend to challenge the power that caused it. But perhaps the most surprising figure connected to this organization is its leader, because the individual guiding the Abyss Order is not a native citizen of Khaenri'ah. They are someone who arrived in Teyvat from another world entirely. Someone who witnessed the Cataclysm firsthand. The lost sibling of the Traveler. 5 centuries have passed since the fall of Khaenri'ah. In that time, the nations of the surface have rebuilt their societies and continued their histories. To most people living in Teyvat, the Cataclysm has become a distant legend. But the consequences of that event have never truly disappeared. The ruins of Khaenri'ah still exist beneath the world. The cursed survivors continue to wander the land. And the Abyss Order continues to pursue its mysterious objectives in the shadows. The destruction of the underground kingdom did not end the conflict between humanity and the heavens. In many ways, it only began it. The destruction of Khaenri'ah did not end when the sky fell. In the historical memory of Teyvat, the Cataclysm is often imagined as a single catastrophic moment. Cities burning, monsters flooding the land, gods descending in judgment. But the truth recorded across scattered pieces of lore in Genshin Impact tells a much darker story. The Cataclysm was not only the destruction of a nation. It was the beginning of a curse that would last for centuries. When Celestia struck Khaenri'ah, the nation did not simply vanish. Its people did not disappear into history the way fallen civilizations normally do. Instead, something far more cruel happened. They survived. But survival came at a terrible cost. In the immediate aftermath of the Cataclysm, the surviving citizens of Khaenri'ah were subjected to what the game describes as a divine punishment. A curse placed upon the entire civilization for the crime of defying the gods. The exact mechanism behind the curse remains one of the greatest mysteries in the lore of Teyvat. However, the effects are clearly documented. The people of Khaenri'ah were transformed. Those of impure bloodlines, citizens whose ancestry had mixed over generations, underwent a horrific change. Their bodies twisted, their forms degraded, their minds slowly deteriorated. They became the creatures now known throughout Teyvat as hilichurls. Hilichurls are so common in the world that most people see them as nothing more than monsters. Adventurers hunt them. Knights clear their camps. Travelers pass them on the road without a second thought. Yet buried within their strange language and primitive rituals lies a tragic truth. They were once human. The game's lore strongly suggests that these creatures are the descendants of the cursed citizens of Khaenri'ah, transformed by divine punishment into something barely recognizable. Their memories faded over time. Their civilization collapsed into scattered tribes. What remains are fragments of a lost culture struggling to survive in a world that no longer recognizes them. This realization casts the entire ecosystem of Teyvat in a darker light. Every hilichurl camp scattered across the landscape may be a distant echo of Khaenri'ah's fallen people. The Cataclysm did not erase them. It condemned them to a slow and agonizing existence. But not everyone suffered the same fate. The lore distinguishes between the general population of Khaenri'ah and those of pure Khaenri'ah blood. Instead of transforming into monsters, these individuals received a different punishment. Immortality. This curse is perhaps even more cruel than the transformation suffered by the hilichurls. While the bodies of pure-blooded Khaenri'ahs remain intact, they are stripped of the natural cycle of life and death. They cannot die. They cannot age normally. And yet they must continue existing in a world that has moved on without them. One of the most well-known survivors bearing this curse is the mysterious figure known as Dainsleif. Dainsleif was once a knight of Khaenri'ah. More specifically, he served as the captain of the royal guard under the Eclipse Dynasty. This position placed him among the highest-ranking defenders of the nation during its final days. He witnessed the Cataclysm not as a distant observer, but as someone standing at the very heart of the disaster. When Khaenri'ah fell, Dainsleif did not die alongside his homeland. Instead, He became one of its cursed remnants. Unlike ordinary humans, his body does not age in a normal way. Centuries have passed since the Cataclysm, yet he still walks the world with the same face he had during Khaenri'ah's final days. But immortality in Teyvat does not mean freedom from suffering. The lore repeatedly references a phenomenon known as erosion. Erosion is a slow mental degradation that affects beings who live far beyond their natural lifespan. Even gods are not immune to it. Over time, memories fade. Personalities change. The weight of centuries begins to erode the mind itself. For cursed Khaenri'ahs like Dainsleif, erosion is an ever-present threat. Imagine carrying the memories of an entire destroyed civilization while being unable to escape the passage of time. Friends vanish. Nations rise and fall. The world continues moving forward while you remain frozen in history. This is the existence that Dainsleif has endured for 500 years. He wanders the nations of Teyvat without a home, without a kingdom, and without the ability to escape the curse placed upon him. His role in the story of Genshin Impact reflects this burden. He acts not as a hero or villain, but as a witness. Someone who remembers the truth of what happened when Khaenri'ah challenged the heavens. Through his dialogue and narration in the game's storyline trailers, players receive glimpses into the deeper history of the world. Dainsleif is one of the few characters who understands the full scale of the Cataclysm and its consequences. Yet even he cannot fully escape its shadow. Another survivor tied to the legacy of Khaenri'ah represents a very different aspect of that lost civilization. This figure is the alchemist known as Albedo. Unlike Dainsleif, Albedo was not born during the height of Khaenri'ah's civilization. His origin lies in the experiments of the legendary alchemist Rhinedottir, often referred to in the lore simply as Gold. Albedo is not a natural human. He is a synthetic life form created through the art of alchemy. This makes him a direct product of the same alchemical traditions that once defined Khaenri'ah's scientific achievements. While the nation itself was destroyed, its knowledge did not disappear entirely. In Albedo, that knowledge lives on. Rhinedottir created him as what the lore describes as a perfect human, a synthetic being designed to replicate the structure of life itself. Unlike other creations such as the dragon Durin, Albedo appears outwardly human in every way. He eats, speaks, thinks, and behaves like any ordinary person. Yet beneath this appearance lies a profound question that continues to shape his character. What does it mean to be human? Albedo's existence places him in a unique position within the world of Teyvat. He is both connected to Khaenri'ah and separate from it. He did not experience the Cataclysm personally, but he carries the legacy of its forbidden science. Now living in Mondstadt as the chief alchemist of the Knights of Favonius, Albedo dedicates his life to studying the nature of existence itself. His research focuses on understanding the structure of the world and the secrets hidden within it. But behind this calm intellectual pursuit lies an undercurrent of uncertainty. Albedo is aware that he was created by Rhinedottir, one of the figures associated with the catastrophic events that helped trigger the fall of Khaenri'ah. He also understands that synthetic life may possess potential dangers that even he cannot fully control. In several story quests, he openly questions whether his existence could someday become a threat to the world. This internal conflict mirrors the larger theme of Khaenri'ah's legacy. The civilization pursued knowledge without limits. It created wonders that rivaled the power of the gods. But that same ambition also led to disaster. Albedo represents both the brilliance and the danger of that legacy. Together, figures like Dainsleif and Albedo embody the two surviving echoes of Khaenri'ah. Dainsleif represents memory. He carries the history of a fallen nation, walking through a world that no longer remembers the truth of what happened 5 centuries ago. Albedo represents continuation. Through him, the scientific ideals of Khaenri'ah continue to exist, evolving quietly within the laboratories of Mondstadt. Neither of them fully belongs to the present era of Teyvat. Both are remnants of a civilization that the gods attempted to erase. And yet the fact that they still exist suggests something important. The Cataclysm did not completely eliminate Khaenri'ah. Its people remain scattered across the world. Some wander under the burden of immortality. Others survive unknowingly as the creatures called hilichurls. And still others exist as creations born from the nation's forbidden science. 500 years after its destruction, The shadow of Khaenri'ah continues to stretch across the history of Teyvat. The fall of the nation was not the end of its story. It was only the beginning of a new and far more mysterious chapter. A chapter that would eventually give rise to one of the most dangerous organizations in the entire world. The Abyss Order. The rise of the Abyss Order did not happen overnight. In the centuries following the destruction of Khaenri'ah, the world of Teyvat slowly rebuilt itself. Cities recovered from the monster invasions that had swept across the land during the Cataclysm. Kingdoms strengthened their defenses. The Archons returned to governing their respective nations. To most of Teyvat, the Cataclysm became history. A terrible event that happened 500 years ago. But for the survivors of Khaenri'ah, the disaster never truly ended. The curse placed upon their people ensured that the memory of their homeland could never fade. Their bodies carried the consequences of Celestia's punishment, and their existence itself became a constant reminder of what had been taken from them. Among these survivors, a new ideology slowly began to take shape. If the gods had destroyed their civilization, then the gods themselves must be the enemy. This belief would eventually grow into a powerful movement, one that would reshape the balance of power across the entire world. That movement became known as the Abyss Order. The Abyss Order is one of the central antagonistic forces within the world of Genshin Impact. Unlike the Fatui, who operate as a political and military organization tied to the nation of Snezhnaya, the Abyss Order exists outside the structure of the Seven Nations entirely. It is not a kingdom. It is not a government. It is an organization born from the ruins of a destroyed civilization. Its members believe that the current order of Teyvat is fundamentally unjust. They see the Archons and Celestia not as protectors of humanity, but as oppressive rulers who manipulate the world from above. From their perspective, the destruction of Khaenri'ah serves as proof that the gods will not tolerate a humanity that grows too powerful or too independent. This belief shapes everything the Abyss Order does. At the center of the organization lies a hierarchical structure composed of several different ranks. The most commonly encountered members are the Abyss Mages. These masked figures appear frequently throughout the regions of Teyvat. They command elemental powers similar to vision holders, though the source of their abilities is not tied to the Archons. Instead, their powers seem to originate from the Abyss itself. Abyss Mages are typically responsible for leading small groups of monsters, conducting experiments, or carrying out operations that destabilize the nations of Teyvat. They are intelligent and capable of speech, often speaking in distorted tones through their masks. Above them exist more powerful entities known as Abyss Heralds and Abyss Lectors. These figures represent a higher level of authority within the organization. They possess far greater combat abilities and appear to act as commanders overseeing larger operations. The Abyss Heralds wield powerful elemental abilities connected to the Abyss, while the Abyss Lectors demonstrate mastery over corrupted forms of elemental energy. Both ranks display a level of intelligence and purpose that distinguishes them from the ordinary monsters that serve beneath them. This suggests that the Abyss Order is not simply a chaotic group of creatures. It is a structured organization with long-term goals. One of the most important questions surrounding the Abyss Order concerns the creatures that make up its armies. Across Teyvat, the organization commands a vast number of monsters. Hilichurls, Abyss creatures, and other corrupted beings frequently appear under the command of Abyss agents. The presence of Hilichurls within these forces is particularly tragic. As revealed through multiple pieces of lore in Genshin Impact, Hilichurls are believed to be the transformed descendants of Khaenri'ah's cursed citizens. Their minds have deteriorated over centuries of existence, leaving behind only fragments of memory. Yet despite this degradation, the Abyss Order appears capable of guiding them. This relationship hints at a deeper connection between the organization and the cursed remnants of Khaenri'ah's people. To the Abyss Order, these creatures may represent more than simple soldiers. They may be the last surviving population of their lost nation. The ideology of the Abyss Order centers on a single core belief. The divine order imposed by Celestia must be overturned. From their perspective, the current structure of Teyvat is built on a system of control. The Archons govern the nations, distributing elemental power through visions, while Celestia remains above them all as the ultimate authority. Khaenri'ah's destruction demonstrated what happens when humanity attempts to break free from that structure. The Abyss Order seeks to challenge this system directly. Rather than serving the gods, They aim to create a world where humanity no longer lives under divine rule. This objective places them in direct opposition to nearly every major power in Teyvat. However, the Abyss Order's leadership introduces an even more surprising element to their story. At the highest level of the organization stands a figure known as the Prince or Princess of the Abyss. This individual is none other than the missing sibling of the Traveler. Depending on the player's chosen protagonist, this role is held by either Ether or Lumen. Before the events of the main story, the Traveler and their sibling arrived in Teyvat together as interdimensional travelers. Shortly after their arrival, they encountered a mysterious being who blocked their attempt to leave the world. The Traveler was sealed away for centuries. When they finally awaken at the beginning of the game's story, their sibling is already gone. Over time, the Traveler discovers that their sibling has become the leader of the Abyss Order. This revelation dramatically changes the stakes of the narrative. The Abyss Order is no longer just an enemy organization. It is directly connected to the Traveler's own family. The siblings' motivations remain one of the greatest mysteries in the story. Throughout the main quests of Genshin Impact, several encounters reveal fragments of their perspective. They claim to have traveled across Teyvat long before the Traveler awakened, witnessing the hidden truths of the world. According to their own words, they have seen the reality behind the rule of the gods. What they discovered led them to side with the Abyss. This suggests that the conflict between the Abyss Order and the Divine Order of Teyvat may be more complicated than it initially appears. From the siblings' perspective, the destruction of Khaenri'ah may represent a larger pattern. A cycle in which powerful civilizations are erased whenever they threaten the authority of Celestia. The Abyss Order's actions throughout the story reflect this broader objective. They attempt to destabilize the nations of Teyvat, conduct experiments involving ancient ruins, and manipulate powerful artifacts tied to the world's deeper history. Many of these activities appear connected to the legacy of Khaenri'ah itself. The organization searches for remnants of lost technology, forgotten knowledge, and ancient power that could help them challenge the existing world order. In other words, the Abyss Order is not simply seeking revenge. They are preparing for something larger. A confrontation with the system that destroyed their homeland. 500 years after the Cataclysm, the conflict that began with the fall of Khaenri'ah continues to shape the world of Teyvat. The Abyss Order represents the lingering consequences of that event. A reminder that the destruction of a civilization does not always bring closure. Sometimes it creates new forces that reshape the future. And as the Traveler continues their journey across the Seven Nations, the presence of the Abyss Order ensures that the truth behind the Cataclysm can never remain buried forever. Because if Khaenri'ah truly was destroyed for challenging the authority of the heavens, then the struggle between humanity and the divine may only be beginning. When the Cataclysm ended, the destruction of Khaenri'ah did not remain confined to a single underground nation. The shockwaves of that event spread across the entire continent of Teyvat. Cities burned. Ancient creatures awakened. Armies of monsters poured across the land. Even the gods themselves were forced into battle in ways that would permanently alter the course of their nations. 500 years later, the scars of that disaster still remain visible in every corner of the world. To understand the true scale of the Cataclysm, it is necessary to look at how each region of Teyvat was affected by the fall of Khaenri'ah. The nation that experienced the most direct consequences of the Cataclysm was Mondstadt. During the chaos that followed the destruction of Khaenri'ah, one of the most terrifying creations born from Rhinedottir's alchemical experiments appeared in the skies above the region. The dragon known as Durin descended upon Mondstadt. Durin was no ordinary dragon. According to the lore of Genshin Impact, he was a synthetic life form created through the forbidden art of alchemy. His body was infused with corruptive power linked to the abyss. Driven by destructive instinct, Durin attacked Mondstadt with devastating force. Poisonous blood rained from the sky as the dragon unleashed destruction upon the land. The defense of Mondstadt fell to two powerful figures, the Anemo Archon Venti, and the legendary dragon of the Four Winds, Dvalin. Together they fought Durin in a massive aerial battle above the mountains that would later become known as Dragon's Pine. The fight ended with Dvalin striking the final blow, killing Durin and sending his massive body crashing into the frozen peaks below. Yet victory came at a cost. Durin's blood was filled with corrosive power, and when it spread across the mountains it poisoned the land itself. Even centuries later, Dragonspine remains a hostile and dangerous region where remnants of that corruption continue to linger. The battle also left a lasting impact on Dvalin. Exposure to Durin's poisonous blood weakened him over time, eventually leading to the corruption that players witnessed during the early storyline of Genshin Impact. Thus, the Cataclysm did not simply threaten Mondstadt for a single moment in history. It planted a wound that would continue to affect the nation 500 years later. Far to the east, the island nation of Inazuma experienced its own devastating losses during the Cataclysm. At that time, the Electro Archon was not the figure known today. The original ruler of Inazuma was Raiden Makoto. Makoto was the twin sister of the warrior who would later become the current Electro Archon, Raiden Ei. During the chaos of the Cataclysm, Makoto traveled to the battlefield connected to the destruction of Khaenri'ah. The exact location of this battle remains unclear in the lore, but it is known that the conflict involved powerful abyssal forces emerging during the disaster. Makoto did not survive. Her death marked one of the most significant divine casualties of the Cataclysm. When Ei discovered what had happened to her sister, the event permanently changed her worldview. The loss deeply affected her understanding of eternity, a concept that would later shape the political philosophy of Inazuma for centuries. After Makoto's death, Ei took her sister's place as the Electro Archon. However, the trauma of the Cataclysm left a lasting impression on her mind. Determined to prevent further loss, she began pursuing an ideal of eternal stability, eventually isolating Inazuma from the rest of the world. In this way, the Cataclysm influenced not only the past of Inazuma, but also the policies that defined the nation's future. The Geo-Archon of Liyue also took part in the battle against the forces unleashed during the Cataclysm. The ancient god known as Moryx, who later walks among mortals as Vonli, was already one of the oldest and most powerful beings in Teyvat by the time of the disaster. When the Cataclysm began, Moryx joined the effort to contain the spreading chaos. While the specific battles he fought during this period are not described in full detail, the lore confirms that Liyue faced numerous abyssal creatures and other dangerous entities that emerged during the catastrophe. Moryx helped ensure that Liyue Harbor survived the disaster. However, the event reinforced something he had already begun to consider. The era of gods directly ruling humanity might eventually need to come to an end. Centuries later, this belief would influence his decision to step down as the active ruler of Liyue and allow the nation to govern itself through its people. Further west, the nation of Sumeru also carries hidden scars from the Cataclysm. Sumeru has long been associated with the pursuit of knowledge. Its scholars dedicate themselves to understanding the structure of the world through research and study. But the Cataclysm revealed a dangerous side to that pursuit. The concept of forbidden knowledge, which had already appeared in ancient times through the experiments of King Dishret, resurfaced once again during the fall of Khaenri'ah. Forbidden knowledge refers to information originating from beyond the natural order of Teyvat, often associated with the abyss. Exposure to this knowledge can corrupt minds, distort reality, and spread chaos across entire regions. During the Cataclysm, the spread of forbidden knowledge became a major threat. The scholars of Sumeru would later dedicate immense effort to studying and containing its effects. The region's academic institutions became deeply cautious about research that might cross into dangerous territory. Thus, the fall of Khaenri'ah reinforced an important lesson for Sumeru. Knowledge without limits can lead to catastrophe. Finally, the frozen mountain of Dragonspine stands as one of the most visible physical reminders of the Cataclysm. Today, Dragonspine appears as a harsh and icy landscape filled with ancient ruins and strange phenomena. Yet beneath the snow lies the body of the dragon Durin, whose fall during the Cataclysm permanently altered the region. The poisonous energy that seeped from Durin's corpse continues to influence the mountain even centuries later. Strange creatures roam the area. Ruins connected to forgotten civilizations lie buried beneath the ice. Travelers who venture too deep into Dragonspine often encounter traces of ancient powers linked to the Cataclysm. The mountain serves as a silent monument to the battle that took place there. A reminder that the events of 500 years ago were not confined to hidden underground ruins. They reshaped the very geography of Teyvat. Taken together, these regional consequences reveal the true scale of the Cataclysm. The destruction of Khaenri'ah was not an isolated punishment carried out by the heavens. It triggered a global disaster that forced every major power in Teyvat to respond. Archons fought monsters born from forbidden experiments. Nations struggled to defend themselves against waves of abyssal creatures. Entire landscapes were permanently altered by the battles that followed. Even 5 centuries later, the world continues to feel the consequences. Every corrupted ruin, every wandering hilichurl tribe, and every mysterious abyssal creature traces its origin back to the same moment in history: the fall of Khaenri'ah. Yet despite everything that has been revealed so far, one crucial question still remains unanswered. Why did Celestia destroy Khaenri'ah in the first place? What kind of threat could justify the complete annihilation of an entire civilization? To answer that question, it is necessary to examine the power that stands above the Archons themselves. Celestia, the floating seat of divine authority that watches over the world of Teyvat, and the mysterious principles that govern its judgment. High above the nations of Teyvat, beyond the reach of ordinary people, there exists a place that almost no one in the world truly understands. A floating island suspended in the sky, a realm believed to be the seat of divine authority. This place is known as Celestia. Within the world of Genshin Impact, Celestia is rarely seen directly, yet its influence shapes nearly every aspect of life across the continent. The Archons rule their respective nations, but even they exist beneath a higher system of power. That higher authority is believed to reside in Celestia. For centuries, the people of Teyvat have viewed Celestia as a distant paradise, a place where those who accomplish extraordinary deeds might ascend and become gods themselves. Legends describe heroes and powerful individuals rising into the sky after achieving greatness. To the average citizen, Celestia represents reward. But the destruction of Khaenri'ah suggests something very different. Because when one civilization attempted to build a world independent of divine authority, Celestia did not reward it. Celestia destroyed it. The concept that governs Celestia's actions is often referred to in the lore as the heavenly principles. These principles represent the rules that maintain the balance of the world. While the exact nature of these laws remains mysterious, they appear to dictate how power, knowledge, and civilization are allowed to develop in Teyvat. When these principles are violated, Celestia intervenes. One of the earliest examples of this intervention appears long before the Cataclysm itself. In the distant past, another powerful civilization existed in the desert regions of what is now Sumeru. This kingdom was ruled by the legendary figure known as King Dishret. Dishret's civilization pursued immense knowledge and technological advancement. Much like Khaenri'ah, it sought to understand forces that existed beyond the natural order of the world. At some point, Dishret gained access to forbidden knowledge connected to the abyss. The consequences were catastrophic. This knowledge spread corruption throughout the land, distorting reality and threatening the stability of the entire region. The disaster ultimately led to the collapse of Dishret's civilization and the transformation of the once great kingdom into the vast desert that now dominates the region. While the full role of Celestia in this event remains unclear, the pattern is striking. A powerful civilization gains access to dangerous knowledge. The world begins to destabilize, and the civilization ultimately collapses. Khaenri'ah appears to represent the most extreme version of this pattern. Unlike the desert kingdom of Dishret, Khaenri'ah existed completely outside the system of the 7 Archons. It did not worship gods, and it did not rely on divine blessings to fuel its progress. Instead, its scientists and alchemists relied on their own discoveries. They mastered alchemy. They created synthetic life. They developed technology capable of rivaling the power of divine beings. From the perspective of Celestia, such a civilization may have represented a fundamental threat to the established order of Teyvat. If humanity could achieve godlike power without relying on divine authority, then the entire system maintained by the heavenly principles would begin to collapse. The destruction of Khaenri'ah may have been Celestia's attempt to prevent that possibility. Yet even this explanation leaves important questions unanswered. If Celestia simply wanted to eliminate a dangerous civilization, why curse its people instead of allowing them to die? The transformation of Khaenri'ah's citizens into hilichurls and immortal wanderers suggests something more deliberate than simple destruction. It appears to be a punishment, a warning. By forcing the survivors to live with the consequences of their civilization's ambition, Celestia ensured that the story of Khaenri'ah would remain etched into the world itself. Every hilichurl tribe wandering across Teyvat stands as a reminder of what happened when humanity challenged the heavens. Every immortal survivor carries the memory of a lost kingdom that once dared to reject the rule of the gods. Another mystery lies in the identity of the entity responsible for enforcing the heavenly principles. At the beginning of Genshin Impact, the traveler encounters a powerful being who prevents them from leaving Teyvat. This mysterious figure introduces herself as the sustainer of heavenly principles. Although her exact identity remains unknown, her appearance suggests a direct connection to the authority of Celestia. With a single gesture, she is able to seal away one of the traveler's siblings and scatter their powers. This brief encounter demonstrates the scale of power possessed by those who enforce the laws governing Teyvat. If such beings act on behalf of Celestia, then the destruction of Khaenri'ah becomes easier to understand. Even a powerful civilization might not stand a chance against forces operating on that level. However, the story of the Cataclysm is not simply a conflict between humanity and the gods. It also represents a philosophical struggle. Khaenri'ah believed in human potential. Its people pursued knowledge, innovation, and independence. They sought to build a future guided by their own achievements rather than divine authority. Celestia, on the other hand, appears to maintain a controlled system in which power is distributed through the archons and visions. From this perspective, the Cataclysm can be seen as a clash between two different visions for the future of humanity. One path leads toward independence. The other preserves a structured world governed by divine oversight. 500 years after the destruction of Khaenri'ah, this conflict has not disappeared. The Abyss Order continues to challenge the authority of the gods. Survivors like Dainsleif wander the world carrying the memory of what was lost. And the traveler continues their journey across the 7 nations, gradually uncovering the hidden history of Teyvat. Each new region reveals fragments of the same larger story. Ancient civilizations that rose and fell. Forbidden knowledge that threatened the balance of the world. And a divine authority that intervenes whenever that balance is threatened. The Cataclysm was not simply a disaster from the past. It was a turning point in the history of Teyvat. A moment when humanity attempted to step beyond the limits imposed by the gods, only to face overwhelming punishment in response. Yet the existence of survivors, the rise of the Abyss Order, and the ongoing journey of the traveler all suggest that the story is far from over. The questions raised by the fall of Khaenri'ah remain unanswered. Was Celestia justified in its actions? Is the system of divine control truly necessary to protect the world? Or did the destruction of Khaenri'ah silence a civilization that might have changed the fate of humanity forever? As the traveler continues exploring the nations of Teyvat, these mysteries slowly move closer to the surface. Because somewhere beyond the clouds, Celestia still watches. And the truth behind the Cataclysm may ultimately decide the future of the entire world.